All right, guys. I hope you are all doing well. Welcome to our first day of distance learning for our class. I know this is going to be a little bit weird to get used to, but by now it's Thursday, so hopefully you guys have had a chance to do this with other classes and you're getting the hang of it. So this is the lecture for the end of World War II in Europe, or at least the middle to the end of it. That'll be our topic for today. This will be one part of the lesson. You'll be listening to this lecture, taking some notes on your notebooks. Hopefully you brought those home. And then you will be completing the other assignment that I post on Google Classroom. So let's go ahead and get started. I know you guys have all been dying for a lecture, so let's go ahead and dive into it. All right, so we're looking at the Allied victory today, the end of World War II. Now, the war at this point, as we talked about a few weeks ago, was still mostly going the way of the Axis powers. In Europe, Germany had really conquered basically all of Europe at this point. They also had large swaths of Africa, mostly North Africa. The Russians, the Soviets, were fighting them back. They had, the Stalingrad had happened at this point, but despite this massive victory for the Soviets, the Germans were still, in control of Europe. And it wasn't until 1942 that the U.S. was able to actually start to send troops in, not until the end of it. So, in 1942, Roosevelt and Churchill meet, and they decide kind of how to proceed with the war. Now, the big thing is that the Soviets wanted the British and the Americans to open a second front against the Germans in Europe. They wanted them to basically invade France and start to or help pull soldiers away from Russia, from the Soviet Union. However, the U.S. and the British, for a variety of reasons, decided to attack North Africa instead. Um, this was done in 1942. In 1943, though, the big three, as they became known, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, they would have the first of a few meetings. This is the Tehran Conference, in which they kind of got together and mapped out their strategy as allied powers. Now, this was from the beginning a pretty difficult relationship, especially between the British, the Americans, against the Soviets, against Stalin in particular, but they were kind of thrust together into being allies, and so they had no other choice but to trust each other, at least at this point, although I would argue neither side fully did trust the other. Here we can see the kind of general strategy of the war. If you kind of draw your attention here to the mouse, you can kind of see it over here. So the Allies are going to first land in North Africa over here, and then going to work their way up from Italy and then move towards Germany from that way. The Soviets are going to start to push back the Germans from Stalingrad over here, start pushing them back towards Germany, and then eventually we'll get to D-Day and we'll see how that launches essentially a third front in this war. So it starts in Africa. Like I said, the Americans and the British decided to invade Africa first. They called it the soft underbelly of Europe. North Africa was not as strongly defended as the rest of Europe, as France and the East. And also, they would have to fight through Italy, which is full of Italians, and we all know how good they are at fighting. Better than the French, I will remind you, but definitely not the strong point for Italians. And so they chose to kind of go that way. Again, going back to the map here for a second, you'll see that the plan was to basically move in from North Africa, jump over to Italy, and then move up from there. So essentially, the British started from Egypt and then started to move back towards the west, whereas Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Americans landed in Tunisia and then started moving east. And then by May of 1943, after some very intense fighting, the Allies had successfully defeated the Germans in North Africa. Like I said, Stalingrad happens as well in 1942. It drags on until 1943. It was a very, very brutal battle. Some say the most brutal of the European theater, and I think there's a lot of arguments to be made for that. The fighting eventually turned into street by street fighting. The Soviets were throwing soldier after soldier at the Germans. The Germans were getting more and more frustrated. Um, the cold of the Russian winter took its toll as well. Many soldiers died just from freezing to death or from lack of supplies, as the Germans could not get supplies to their soldiers. And eventually, after 10 months of fighting, the Germans retreated away from Stalingrad. This was obviously a very big point for both Stalin and Hitler. For Hitler, he wanted to capture Stalingrad. It had Stalin's name, and Stalin obviously wanted to protect that city. In August 1943, the Americans and the British captured Sicily, continuing their kind of push towards Germany from the south. Now, Italy, I must say, was never as in favor of Mussolini as Germans were of Hitler, I would say, and I think many historians would agree with that. And so when they saw the cracks in Mussolini's armor, when Sicily was invaded and captured by the Americans and the British, Mussolini was eventually driven to power. The Italian government surrendered and switched sides to join the Allies. However, Hitler and the Germans still controlled most of Italy. So while the Italian government had essentially surrendered and switched sides, Germany still controlled most of Italy. Um, Both the British and the Americans, as well as the Soviets, suffered at home as well. Citizens, they suffered at home. This was a total war, much like World War One, but even more so. There were constant attacks on both British and Soviet soil. The Soviets probably got the worst of it. And then in the US, as well as in those other countries, there was a shortage of goods, food, tires, gas, clothing. And so in many of these countries, the government rationed goods, again, like in World War One, basically limited the consumption. And then also certain goods were just really, really difficult to find, especially in Britain and the Soviet Union. Again, thankfully, because of our geography, the Americans were able to kind of leave a little bit more unscathed than the other competitors in this war. Now, in the US, we have the attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to a very general mistrust of all Japanese Americans. You'll learn much more about this next year in US history, but essentially, the US government forced thousands, about 120,000 Japanese Americans, um, on the West Coast, California, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, and basically forced them into relocation camps throughout the Western United States. And what's very important to note here is that two-thirds of these people were actually American citizens. Not, not that would make it better, but if they were Japanese citizens, it might be at least a little bit more understandable as to why there might be some shred of doubt as to which side they're loyal to. However, these were American citizens, largely, and many of them were still denied their basic rights, their due process, their trial by jury, and were essentially interned for a large portion of the war. Now, it's also important to note that these camps were nothing like the camps in Germany. They were not slave labor camps or death camps, but it was essentially being thrown in jail for having done nothing wrong besides being Japanese or of Japanese descent. It's also important to note that there were small numbers of Germans and Italians that were also interned in these camps. However, those numbers were much smaller. For the Germans, it was about 2,000 people, even though there are many, many more German Americans in the US, about multiple millions. And the Italians also, many, many millions of Italians living in the US, and only about 257 were ever interned. So we can definitely see kind of the role that race may have played here, as well as the impact of Pearl Harbor. And here we see a photo of some children at one of the camps. So, going back to Europe, we eventually have the invasion of France, which is known famously as D-Day. The eventual D-Day invasion would take place on June 6th. It was also known as Operation Overlord. This is definitely one of the most famous actions or events of World War II. And this essentially led to the beginning of the end, the true beginning of the end, I would argue, for Germany's chances of winning the war. Once the Allies had been able to fight their way onto the beaches of Normandy, once they started to capture the German defenses, they were able to start to push through France, eventually moving the Germans out of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and most of the Netherlands, at this point knocking on Germany's door. And the Allies would not repeat their mistake of not invading Germany as they had done in World War I. And so they had full intentions of going all the way to Germany to finish the job. Here we see a very famous photo. It's showing the D-Day invasion. This is one of the landing ships, and all these soldiers heading out onto the beaches, just facing a barrage of fire and and bombs and all sorts of really brutal elements of this war. Some more photos as well here. Soldiers landing on the beach behind the tank guards. All right. So eventually, victory in Europe would happen. The Soviets were also pushing through the east and moving towards Germany. Hitler made one last desperation attack, which would be known as the Battle of the Bulge, because the Allied lines bulged, but they never broke. So they were able to push the Allies back, but never able to actually break through the lines and defeat the Allies. By the end of April in 45, the Soviets had reached Berlin. It was actually the Soviets who got there first before the Americans and the British. Hitler committed suicide before facing the music, and about a week later, Germany surrendered, thus ending World War II in Europe. Now, next week we'll continue our look at the Pacific, but for now we're going to just pause here for this week. So as you'll see on the assignment, you'll be looking at kind of the aftermath of the war in Europe, and kind of drawing some conclusions as to how did the war impact people and how were people's lives changed by the end of the war. Obviously, it was such a momentous event, it was very difficult to go back to normalcy, and so our assignment there will kind of explore how did people return as much as they could to normalcy at the end of World War II. So I'm going to leave you guys here. I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. I will go ahead and sign off on this. Make sure to check Google Classroom for all of the assignments for today, as well as the attendance. If you have not done so yet, please make sure to log in for attendance. And that's it. Thank you guys. I hope to see you soon, and I hope you guys are all doing well.